Awesome, thank you. Oops, yep. Right. Hello everyone, how's everyone doing? Before I start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on Indigenous land and paying my respects to elders past and present. My name's Rhea Creado. I think Charles sort of introduced me, but my pronouns are she, her. I'm a transdisciplinary artist, an educator, a researcher. I am a PhD candidate here at QUT, and I also teach in the School of Early Childhood and Inclusive Education. And today I'm going to talk about the potential for Zoom art workshops to support children as change makers. So the participants that I worked with in my study, this is actually my PhD study. Sorry, I'm just going to move over because I've got the light right in my eye. So the participants that I worked with in my study were children based in New York City, and they were all aged 5 to 10 years old. And now, prior to the pandemic, like maybe many of us in this room, I had very little knowledge of how Zoom works. I had very little experience with Zoom, and I definitely never worked with children on Zoom before this. But just to give you a little background of where this study began, so it began when I was actually living in New York City. So I moved there to do my master's degree at New York University, and it was a master's degree that was centered on art activism and art education. So as a result, I found myself very much involved in the artist activist scene in New York City. I was attending all sorts of socially engaged actions, protests, rallies, marches, town hall meetings, you name it, I was there. I was going to all of these things because I was learning so much. I was learning things that I had never learned at school or at university. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, why have I never learned any of this before? And where was all of this when I was a child? I also observed when I was going to a lot of these socially engaged actions that there were barely any children present most of the time. So around a similar time, I also began teaching at institutions, various institutions in New York City. But one of the jobs that I got was developing and facilitating art workshops at the Children's Museum of Manhattan. And I was working with children. I was developing and working with children aged 5 to 10 years old. So it was really at the Children's Museum of Manhattan that I began experimenting with socially engaged art workshops for children of that age group who were 5 to 10 years old. And so when I began the study, what I was really interested in was how the work of artists and activists based in New York City could potentially inform arts pedagogy for children and support children as change makers. And then COVID hit. So just to preface, I had moved to Brisbane about 3 weeks before the pandemic began. I'd moved here from New York. And so I realized I was in Brisbane, the children that I wanted to work with were all the way in New York City, and I had no way to travel there. But thank God for Zoom, right? So I knew I wanted to conduct social justice art workshops with children in New York City, but I realized that if I was going to do this over Zoom, the Zoom workshops would have to be flexible enough and accommodating so that the children could work with materials that they already had available to them at home. So during this process of developing and planning and planning these workshops, I also wrote and illustrated 2 children's books, which you see up here on the screen. The first one, which is to my right, is I Am So Very Truly Magnificently Happy. And so this book actually details the narratives of LGBTQ+ children and children belonging to LGBTQ+ families. And the idea behind this narrative was really to provide representation for the LGBTQ+ community and introduce LGBTQ+ identities to young children who may not have been exposed to them prior. The narrative was very much informed by the emphasis on LGBTQ+ rights that I had observed at socially engaged actions that I was attending in New York City, and it was very much inspired by the work of queer New Yorkers in furthering social change. So book number 2 was titled How Wild Gentrification Is All Around Us. And this one follows a non-binary brown child named Wild, whose neighborhood is experiencing gentrification, which is very much a reality for many neighborhoods in New York City and neighborhoods across the world as well. when I was living in New York City, gentrification was probably one of the most discussed topics. But I understand that many children and adults, including myself until I was fairly older, have very little knowledge of what gentrification is, or how how colonization is intrinsically linked with gentrification. And once again, this narrative, this picture book was also informed by the work of New York City artists and activists and their emphasis on decolonizing through their work. So each Zoom workshop that I developed was centered around one of these two books, and there were 8 children in total who participated in my workshops. Each of them attended a workshop on their own, so it was a collaboration between me and the child, and the books were sent out to parents or guardians via email prior to the workshop. So they were asked to choose one book, read it before the workshop, and then that's when the workshop began. So the workshops consisted of one of two things. So the first thing was dialogue. It was dialogue between the child and myself that was facilitated using the inquiry-based learning approach, which was basically open-ended questions which were used to encourage critical and agentic thinking. And secondly, inspired by the use of posters, signs, and banners by artists and activists, the children were invited to create their own posters during the workshops, and I did the same on my side of the screen. So essentially, despite the distance, Zoom allowed us to be engaged in a collaborative art-making process where we were supporting each other in thinking about social change. So for children who read the first book, I am so very truly magnificently happy. We began the workshops by discussing the book before reflecting on the discrimination that the LGBTQ+ community sometimes faces. Many of the children didn't know that LGBTQ+ families even existed prior to reading this book. So I remember one of the children who was participating in my workshop, he said to me, "I can't believe he has 2 moms," when talking about one of the characters in the books. And I said, "Yeah," and he said, "Oh, that's so cool." A couple of the children who participated had friends with same-sex parents, so they knew about the LGBTQ+ community, but none of my participants knew about the discrimination that the LGBTQ+ community often faces. So we discussed this a little, and we talked about what we could potentially do to advocate against this discrimination. And so I invited the children who participated to create posters, and I encouraged them to each come up with a message for their poster that advocated against discrimination of the LGBTQ+ community. So here are some of their messages that they came up with. So child 1 said that from reading the book, they learned that people are born differently and that everyone's just a little bit different. And their message was, it's okay that you are different, you just be yourself. Child 2 from the book learned not to be mean to people from the LGBTQ+ community because they're the same as you. They just have different families and it only matters if they're happy, which eventually evolved into a shorter message on their poster, which was happiness plus love equals equality. And child 3's message was, don't focus on the negatives, focus on your positives. So about half of my participants chose to read the other book, How Wild Gentrification Is All Around Us. And so towards the end of this book, there's a few activity pages that ask the reader to brainstorm potential solutions to help Wild's community as it becomes gentrified. And in response, the children came up with a whole lot of solutions for how they could facilitate change. These included making art, being friends with the gentrifiers, having community conversations, hanging up banners, marching, protesting, along with a variety of other ideas. So now the last 2 pages of the book, as you can see here, include suggestions of practices employed by artists and activists in New York City. Now, most of these things you'd have to do with a large group of people. For posters and banners, this last one here on the right, that we could do during Zoom workshops. So that's what the children did. And they brainstormed messages for their posters for ways to evoke change within Wild's community. So child 4 wanted to make Wild's community feel better about potentially having to move because of the gentrification they were facing. So their message was, it's fine to be in a new neighborhood, be happy in the new neighborhood. Child 5 came up with an idea to create an art club so that Wild's community could have a safe space to come together. So their poster actually advertised their art club. Child 6 said, don't close the shops, because a lot of shops were closing in the community because of gentrification. Child 7, their message was aimed at the gentrifiers, and it said, stop making us sad, come together and make Wild's family happy again, and put the same stores that you knocked down back up. And Child 8 said, stop closing down all the cool shops just because they're not shops that you like. And in talking about gentrification during our discussions, a few of the children also reflected on the gentrification that they were observing in their own neighborhoods. And during the workshops, we spent some time discussing potential ways for them to resist it. Here are some of the posters that the children made. So both versions of the workshops provided opportunities for children to explore social justice issues already being discussed by artists and activists. But I wanted to explore how I could further engage the children in a process of change making. And one thing that I learned when I was speaking to artists and activists in New York City was their consideration of audience engagement and visibility when developing their work. And this was a really important aspect of the change-making process. So I encouraged the children to also consider how they might use their work, their posters, to get that message across. So we reflected on things like color choices and location to increase visibility. Several of the children suggested using bright colors so that, their posters would stand out. One child included blank space on their poster so that viewers could physically engage with their artwork and write on it. One child suggested displaying their poster in the center of town. Another said that they wanted to put their poster up on the tallest building so that more people could see it. Whilst a third child suggested that they wanted to have their poster hanging in the streets with lights all around it so more people could see it. And a few of the children actually suggested placing their posters in their windows so that passers-by could see it. Because during COVID and in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening all across the US, they noticed that their neighbors were placing signs and banners in their windows. And so what the workshops really highlighted was that children were drawing from their own experiences and observations in order to explore how they could best affect change. And one of the things that we often see when we look at socially engaged art is collaboration and gathering of large groups of people to demand change or to resistance. But when this was no longer possible during the pandemic, Zoom offered this really great alternative that provided opportunities for collaboration and dialogue and art making between the children and myself, which also highlighted the potential for other artists and children to engage in a collaborative practice of social change making via Zoom. And in analyzing the children's dialogues during these workshops and the messages on their posters, it was clearly evident how engaging children in a process of art making within these autonomous desensual spaces, even when done through Zoom, motivated their critical and agentic thinking. And furthermore, it allowed them opportunities to think of themselves as change makers and actively engage in a process of change making. Thank you.